Salutations, respected viewers. I am George from Ireland, and it being the 23rd of April, it's Shakespeare Day. I use my words advisedly because people often erroneously claim it's his birthday. It's the day of his baptism. The day of his birth is not recorded. It might have been that day, more likely it was a few days earlier. Because back then, in the 16th century, we didn't wait a few months to hold a big party when the baby was born. The baby was baptized unceremoniously, and that was that. And the father took the baby to be baptized, and the mother wasn't there, still viewed as spiritually unclean, and no doubt, recovering postpartum. So William Shakespeare, a name that should need no introduction. He was born in Stratford-upon-Avon in England. So it's a market town in Western England. England's not a large place, but the English consider Stratford to be quite far from London, over 100 miles to the west of London. So Shakespeare's father was a glover and prominent citizen of the town, serving on the town council, who prospered in his trade. And these things obviously had to be handmade in those days, machinery being in its infancy. So the Shakespeare family, they're also friends of the Harvard family, a scion of which, John Harvard, became a clergyman, moved to Boston and donated his library as a bequest to the college that then existed at Cambridge, Massachusetts, simply known as the college back then, and gave its name to Harvard University. So William Shakespeare, although he wasn't that well off, they were solidly middle class. They've been prominent in the area for a few generations. He went to the local grammar school. You've got to remember this is a time when literacy was as low as 30%, not quite sure. And why do we say grammar? Well, they're obviously learning English, but mainly they're learning Latin and ancient Greek grammar, because English was a peasant language. Anything worthwhile would be written in these classical languages. They might have dipped into a teensy bit of French or Italian if they were lucky. A little bit of mathematics, hardly any science. There wasn't very much scientific knowledge around back then. Obviously boys only. Girls, well, they were lucky if they could write their names. What were they needed schooling for? So the schoolmasters would knock a bit of an education into these boys. And obviously most children, even boys, didn't go to school at all. So if you went to school even to your early teens, you were lucky. So Shakespeare, well, we don't know much about his schooling. We know where the school was. The building still stands. Obviously did well at school. So there's a rumour that his father was a Roman Catholic. Remember, in England at the time, the Church of England was the church as by law established. The Reformation had taken place a few decades before William Shakespeare's birth. And so that was it. You must be Church of England, Reformed. People sometimes say Protestant. Protestant, it's not quite accurate to describe the Church of England, but there we are. And if you belong to the wrong religious denomination, if you're a Catholic, you needed to keep it quiet. You're a recusant. You refuse to recant Catholicism. You're still loyal to the Pope. You'd be viewed as deeply suspect. They were discriminated against, the Catholic minority. They were persecuted. So we're not sure if his father was a Catholic or not. Not terribly important, I suppose. But at the age of 18, William Shakespeare wed Anne Hathaway. Only a few months later, she was delivered of a bonny baby girl. So this was less than 9 months, decidedly less than 9 months. It wasn't simply a premature birth, because it was that premature that the baby would have died. And a few years later, they were blessed with twins, a girl and a boy. Hamlet and Juliet, if I got that right. The first daughter was Susanna. And this is why the twin motif seemed to fascinate William Shakespeare. Twins, fraternal twins, girl and boy, who look so alike they can be mistaken for each other, and sometimes identical twins. So if you've seen Twelfth Night, they're twins, girl and boy, who look so similar that people get them mixed up and they swap identities. Or Two Gentlemen of Verona, two gentlemen in that Italian city who are identical twins, separated at birth, and they both have slaves, and in each case the slave is the identical twin of the other, and so they get mixed up. Or the comedy of errors, things like that. So this is a motif which appears repeatedly in Shakespeare's oeuvre. Anyway, ghosts, yes. You get ghosts in a few of his plays, Macbeth, or Macdeath, as I prefer to call it, or perhaps deserves a video of its own. So William Shakespeare, well, I'm being more thematic now than chronological. He's well known for his vulgarity. Well, like Geoffrey Chaucer before him, unafraid to pepper his plays with bawdy jokes, bit of ribaldry. If you've seen Henry V, and their jokes about dildos and so on, I can't remember the other things. French women mispronouncing English words. So don't tell me this isn't apposite on the stage these days. Oh, we can't have something so low. Shakespeare's considered very highbrow these days, but there was some bathos there as well. It had a populist appeal. So the masses had to be brought in, pulling the punters by some foreigner bashing, some xenophobia, chauvinism, all the rest of it, as well as some lavatorial humour, as well as some blue jokes. Or the Sir Toby Belch, a character in one of Twelfth Night. Yes, it's that crude. And then people think that they're very erudite for appreciating Shakespeare, and this is somehow morally improving. Anyway, we know he moved to London in his early manhood and began acting, part of the Lord Chamberlain's company. So there's the River Thames these days, which bisects London. Back then, London was only north of the River Thames. South of the River Thames was not London. But south of the river, the eastern bit, what we now call London, was Surrey, a separate county. And the eastern bit was Kent, and the western bit was Surrey. So you were outside London. And the city of London was very much controlled by Puritans. That was a religious movement within Christianity, within the Church of England, and with other Protestant sects, Baptists and so on, were emerging at the time, saying, no, thou shalt not. So binding with briars my joys and desires, as Blake later said, so that they can be summed up by the phrase, no singing, no dancing, believe that there's no such thing as an innocent pleasure. Puritans want us to be pure, be clean, rid ourselves of these vices, which would be drunkenness, ribaldry, bad language, gambling, sports, all sports, including cockfighting, bear baiting, board games, theatre, makeup, women showing their hair, jewellery, colourful clothing, really anything that makes life worth living, eating too much, whatever it is, not working all the time, got to be working or sleeping or praying, washing. All right, cleanliness is next to godliness, but that's that. So they really disliked the theatre. So the theatre was banned in the City of London. People crossed over London Bridge. They were in Surrey, or Kent rather, Kent more accurately. Or they just took the boat across the River Thames. And then there was the theatre, the Globe Theatre, the Rose Theatre, a few others. Now, built up that Southwark, this town just south of London, Southwark had built up so much, it was effectively part of London. Legally, it wasn't. That's why theatres were permitted there. So he was regularly travelling back and forth between London and Stratford-upon-Avon, where his growing family resided. And legend has it he stopped off at the Bear pub in Oxford, which still stands, and would refresh himself with some spirituous liquor. So yes, fortified by that, he'll be able to continue his journey on to Stratford-upon-Avon. Often, I think, breaking his journey overnight, because even on horseback, it was probably 2 days' ride. So he acted in many plays and then started writing plays. His complete works consist of 30-something plays. And there's even a bit of dispute over the authorship, which is why I don't give you a precise number. So, and then he helped set up the Globe Theatre, this wooden O, as he calls it. He often has a narrator at the beginning introducing the play. So, obviously it was open to the elements, as it is today, the replica which is built almost on the original site. And people were eating things, because when they excavated the site in the early 90s, they found all sorts of acorn shells and whatnot. There's now no sound system in the 16th century, of course. It wasn't great for acoustics, because in a church, for example, you'd have like a solid metal board above your head if you're preaching, and that would bounce the sound towards them, and they'd have hard surfaces to capture the sound, but not so in the theatre. It relied simply on voice projection, so it was very demanding on the actors. Go easy on your larynx. And so it was open to the elements, the wind and the rain and all the rest of it, and prostitutes were walking around plying their trade, because again, they were just outside London, where their activities were not tolerated by the decidedly po-faced authorities, the Corporation of London. was as in it's an elected council. It wasn't a company, the corporation. Anyway, all the world's a stage, Shakespeare felt, and so all the world was represented in there. Well, as far as where, I suppose Egypt, it didn't set place anywhere further away afield than that. So he knew the dramatis personae, and so he was writing for a cast because he knew everyone in the company. Could think, oh yes, I'll write this line for him, or she'd be suitable for that role, except he wouldn't have said she, there was no she. Remember, women were not allowed to take to the stage in those days. Only males could tread the board. So female parts had to be taken by prepubescent boys, dressed up as women. Because remember what the Holy Bible says, the female voice is nakedness. Women were not permitted to act until well into the 18th century. It was not quite respectable. They were discriminated against. Even the Catholic Church was very much disapproving of theatre, though it didn't actually ban it. I know England wasn't a Catholic country, but the attitude of Protestant authorities was similar. The Church of England was decidedly iffy about it, and then Protestants outside the Church of England, Baptists, Presbyterians, and so on, they thought it was deeply immoral. So there was no law of copyright in those days. So Shakespeare could have made money by printing his works, but what happened is various printers, they spoke to actors, they bribed the actors, tell me all your lines, we'll write it down, and as much of the lines of other actors as you can. And so based on that, these first folios were printed in Shakespeare's lifetime. Now necessarily some errata slipped into that. Well, Ellis-Island mistakes almost of, you said this word and I misheard it as the other one. As not all the actors were literate, couldn't check the script or what was written down, or indeed misremembering their colleagues' lines. So some of the plays were performed in the Inns of Court because they had a degree of autonomy, sometimes outside the purview of the Corporation of London's authorities. So the 4 Inns of Court, this is literally an inn where people stayed overnight for barristers, that's lawyers and judges, and they had a hall, as in a dining room, but also they could perform plays there or have any sort of public meeting there. Gray's Inn, Lincoln's Inn, Middle Temple, and Inner Temple. Those are the 4 Inns of Court. So I can't remember which one of Shakespeare's plays was originally performed in that hall. But Her Majesty the Queen heartily approved of theatre. Elizabeth I watched some performances. But as I say, the religious authorities were decidedly unhappy with theatre. The Church of England did actually forbid it, but they did not think it was respectable. There was a whiff of iniquity about it. So men could perform in the presence of women. Women were not allowed to perform in the presence of men. Not singing, not speaking in public. I mean, the Queen would give speeches, but apart from that, no acting. So that was that. So it's completely acceptable for women to watch men perform, but not vice versa. You may have seen Shakespeare in Love, came out 20 years ago, and this is a theme in that play. What's her name? That American actress with a Welsh name who's performing. Gwyneth Paltrow, and pretended to be a boy, pretended to be a woman. Anyway, so at one stage in Shakespeare's career, there's the lost years. Nobody knows quite what he was doing, the various theories. Was he a teacher in the countryside? He seemed to have writer's block, just couldn't get anything out. But anyway, he overcame that. So his plays are a little bit formulaic, not that that's a bad thing, but they're almost invariably in 5 acts. And they're comedies, tragedies, histories. As you know, they can be easily divisible into those 3 categories. And they will usually have a protagonist who sometimes is eponymous with the play, like Hamlet or Macbeth, or there are more examples. Or there could be 2 of them, Antony and Cleopatra, Julius Caesar, although Julius Caesar dies before halfway. So 5 acts usually, and in the 4th act, the principal character usually has a break, so he can gather himself to come on for a great deal of emotion. At the end, his Gotterdammerung, or whatever it is, depending on the play. Hamlet, I think this is one of the main criticisms of Hamlet. It relies too heavily on Hamlet, and I think that's a debility, because if the actor isn't quite up to it, then it's going to be a disastrous production. Likewise, King Lear. For my money, Lear is the worst one he ever penned, because it's pedestrian, and how does somebody act a lunatic without overdoing it? It's bland, it's banal. It really doesn't do it for me. I've seen it on stage, I've watched the film, I've read the script. But hey, you can't get everything right. What's his magnum opus, difficult to say, possibly Macbeth, perhaps the most widely quoted. If it were done, if it were done, it were better to be done quickly, or there's a Lady Macbeth character, things like that. Is this a dagger I see before me? Anyway, so Elizabeth I was the queen for most of his life. March 1603, she was called to her reward, and her second cousin once removed, James VI of Scotland, came to South Britain and became King James I of England, whilst still ruling Scotland. So he was writing Elizabethan propaganda and Jacobean propaganda, looking back into their ancestry, who are these people at the top of their family tree, and trying to present them as sympathetic characters, as formidable leaders, as morally upstanding. And that's why he penned Macbeth and other plays about this 11th century Scottish monarch. Almost nothing's known about Macbeth, which allowed wide scope for imagination. There are even certain people in his life, and we don't know, is this his sister or is this his cousin, for instance, or years of birth, just not recorded sometimes. But it was a real historical character. And by the way, those are real locations that are mentioned, like Cawdor Castle or Glamis or all the rest of them, because I was at prep school in Scotland when I was little, and these are all real places. Our dormitories are named after these real castles. Anyway, so there's a bit of anti-Semitism in his plays, and the anti-Semitism was widespread. Remember, the Jewish community had all been booted out of England in 1290. Despite that, over 300 years later, there's still sufficient anti-Jewish prejudice that he actually puts this in there. But then is he being sympathetic? In The Merchant of Venice, Shylock is mistreated, and he writes some very moving lines. Hath a Jew not eyes? Have a Jew not hair and heart, and all the rest of it? If we are tickled, we will not laugh. If we are wronged, will we not revenge? Remember the pound of flesh that Shylock has to provide, and so many of these. So many of his expressions have entered the English language. So William Shakespeare, well, we owe him a most tremendous debt for enriching our vocabulary, and people often allude to his works without even realising what they're doing. So there was some anti-Irish prejudice in his work. Look at Captain Macmorris in Henry V. Possibly that's hibernophobic. Captain Morris doesn't want people to speak of his nation, and has written in an Irish accent, Shakespeare's version of it. Or someone else, another character in another play, saying, I'd rather hear my dog howl in Irish than listen to you, as though listening to the Irish language is a ghastly thing. Anyway, so there is some sheer invention in Shakespeare's work, but I suppose that would be artistic license. The Wars, the Roses, according to him, them going to this garden by where the Inns of Court are now, and plucking roses, the House of York and the House of Lancaster, two branches of the English royal family, the red rose of Lancashire and the white rose of York, and that kicked off a 30-year civil war. All right, there were very long periods of peace in the middle. The actual amount of fighting in the Wars of the Roses only amounts to about 12 months. And the Wars of the Roses, it wasn't known as that at the time. It was only in the 19th century Sir Walter Scott, looking back, called it the Wars of the Roses. So Shakespeare, for a very comprehensible reason, abominated the Puritans. Well, he certainly gets my vote for that. Were absolute killjoys, and that's why he mercilessly ridiculed them in Twelfth Night. There's that character Malvolio, I wish evil, his name means, who's a Puritan, who's the major domo, and wears these ridiculous cross-gartered stockings because people have played a prank on him, sending this billet doux from his mistress, as in the woman he works for, telling him that she'll really have the hots for him if he does that. So it's notable that Italy is the locale for so many of his plays. And take Romeo and Juliet. In Fair Verona, where we lay our scene, that's the opening line of it. Are there more of them? Two Gentlemen of Verona would be another one. Obviously, Julius Caesar's from there. Antony and Cleopatra, well, Mark Antony's from there. The Comedy of Errors, there may be more. Or even Twelfth Night, well, they're in Illyria, what we now call the coast of Croatia. They appear to have come from Italy. Or Othello, set in Cyprus, but they're Venetians, because Cyprus was a Cypriot colony at the time, and on and on. So he's the Bard of Avon, because the river Avon flows through his hometown. Is he overrated? Is his work turgid? Is it sententious, perhaps overwritten, over-florid, polysyllabic? I don't think so. I think he vivified our language. And language was more descriptive because we didn't have the visual arts so much at the time. And the British Isles have been through a cultural revolution some decades earlier. The stripping of the altars, the dissolution of the monasteries, iconoclasm, smashing down statues, and painting over religious art in churches. So, yeah, a Chinese visitor in the 60s quite correctly said, you had a cultural revolution too, and is not far wrong. So about this time, because people didn't have so much visual stimulation, there's suddenly an explosion in imagery in language, and Shakespeare, I suppose, is part of that. He was rivals, indeed friends, with other notable playwrights at the time, Christopher Marlowe, perhaps most prominent among them, and he overlapped with his lifetime with some other well-known poets, for instance, John Donne. So he also composed the sonnets, and they're very unimaginatively titled, Sonnet 1, Sonnet 2, Sonnet 3, Sonnet 4, and so on. You can buy them a rather slim volume, and there's a story to the whole thing. People often don't realise there's this unifying thread running through them. So one of the characters seems to represent William Shakespeare, but it's not too blatant in your face that this is story, and people think it's semi-autobiographical, who is in love with a woman, but is having a physical relationship with a man. So it's a love triangle. And then the inevitable happens. Shakespeare's male lover meets this woman who is the object of affections, and the two fall for each other, and Shakespeare's left outside. He doesn't spell it out, obviously, because the most detestable crime of buggery was punishable by death until 1861. So we're not certain he was gay, even though he did wear an earring, and I think it was in his right ear. See that portrait? Right ear, right queer, they used to say. So hetero men used to wear them in the left ear. I've never pierced my ears. So sonnets, they're written to this very tight format in terms of metrical feet and so on, and the rhyme scheme. There are various times like Petrarch and sonnets and so on. But he introduced it as a form of poetry in the English language. So he wrote no prose, notably. There's the tortoise story, but that's different. Because the novel didn't exist as a literary form in English not till Daniel Defoe. I can't remember, was it Moll Flanders the very first, or was it that one about Alexander Selkirk's story, Robinson Crusoe possibly? Well, really, Miguel de Cervantes invented the novel as we know it, with Don Quixote. I know if you go back to Satyricon by Petronicus, some people say that that's the first novel in Latin, but certainly in modern times there were no novels until that came along. We had stories, folk tales, which were just oral and later written down, but there weren't novels as such, something which is self-confessedly a work of fiction. So we only ever compose things in poetry, and of course most of his play scripts are poetry, a little bit of it is in prose. So his name was spelt several different ways at the time, and there's almost nothing in his own handwriting. So it left some people to doubt, did he exist at all? Could a fairly ordinary chap from Stratford have composed all these marvellous works of literature? It had to be someone more learned than that, because how did he know so much about Italy, for example? So there are these theories that actually the Earl of Southampton, but these are debunked now. They're widely accepted by scholars to be bogus, that it was him. His life is fairly well recorded. So he's had a tremendous impact on our language, and there are so many well-known figures of speech which belong to him. Well, he innovated, so far as we know, like out of thin air, more sinned against than sinning, it was all Greek to me. I could go on all day. You can see that list by Bernard Levin saying, you're quoting Shakespeare, you say, as dead as a doornail, things like that. So he liked alliteration, full fathom five, my father lies, and things like that. And you notice he wrote in metre, not 100 centimetres, but metre, metrical feet, as in de-dum, 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 dum. Shall I compare the two a summer's day? As in syllables being stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, and so on, like that. Okay? Cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war is not such a good example. Anyway, the one about Summer's Day, thou art more lovely and more temperate, and things like that. And you try writing something like that. It's incredibly tricky to write in lines of 10 syllables. And all right, he sometimes spills over into 11. But the sentence doesn't have to be 10 syllables. It can go on. Say, why so can I, or so can any man, but will they come when you do call for them? Things like that. She is the fairy's midwife and she comes. Then myriad examples. So cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war. That quotation, for instance, has given its name to The Dogs of War, the novel by Frederick Forsyth, and indeed Cry Havoc, Simon Mann's autobiography. A horse, my kingdom for a horse, in Richard III, another one where there's the title role is the principal character. The Battle of Bosworth, and some people, of course, take that as gospel. But it can be read either way. Obviously, he's demonized, he's physically disabled, and for centuries we weren't sure that was actually true until his body was excavated in 2012. Is he saying he wants a horse to get back on his horse to fight the Battle of Bosworth more effectively, or is he trying to skedaddle out of there on the steed? To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to take arms against the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, and so on. The opening line of Hamlet. And obviously it lends its name to Mel Brooks's comedy. Well, actually, it's originally a Second World War comedy. It's produced during the war, but remade by him in the 80s. So again, so many subsequent writers have drawn inspiration from him. There are things which are misattributed to him. For example, Paths of Glory Lead But to the Grave. That's by Thomas Gray, an 18th century poet. It's not Shakespeare. He invented the name Jessica, for instance. Now, if you find Shakespeare quite challenging, because it's just not contemporary language, you ought to read Shakespeare Made Easy. As this teacher from Liverpool wrote it in the 60s, just sort of rewriting Shakespeare in contemporary English. But to some extent, Shakespeare was the father of modern English, because prior to that, we had Middle English, which is almost incomprehensible. Go back 200 years earlier and see what Geoffrey Chaucer was writing. He was the only other writer prior to Shakespeare which came close to him in shaping the language. And Chaucer's almost impenetrable, even for quite a learned person. Whereas Shakespeare, if you're a well-educated person, is not that difficult. You'll rarely have to look words up. Yes, words are antiquated, but they're still understandable. So Shakespeare, he died in his baptismal day, at the age of 52, if memory serves. I suppose, and he's buried there in Stratford-upon-Avon in the church. You can see where his grave is. There's the birthplace trust, so you can see his house. It's owned by an American college now, and that is the marvelous and peerless Shakespeare. I think perhaps we do pay a bit too much attention to him sometimes, to the virtual exclusion of other writers who are not so well known but deserve more attention, like Marlowe. But obviously, his time was cut short because he was killed in a pub crawl at the age of 27. Pub brawl, not pub crawl, forgive me. I've had a few glasses of wine. You can possibly deduce that from my conduct and my speech. But back to Shakespeare. I think we should concentrate on other writers. Shakespeare still deserves to be on the curriculum, but perhaps we pay a little bit too much attention to him. And there are other writers who ought to get more of a look in. As Shakespeare would have said, all's well that ends well.